All right, folks, we are in the presence of royalty. Please welcome Pinhead himself, Doug Bradley.
Where am I? Here?
Right here. Yeah.
What's the big fluffy one in the middle?
For the camera.
Ah, hello camera. Oh God, do I have to be careful what I'm saying, do I?
So,
It's be all over YouTube. Hello YouTube. I've got into trouble that way before now.
how has your
Hi.
weekend been?
Remarkably good. Thank you, Sacramento. And I'll tell you, I don't mind saying this, I didn't think it was going to be. I don't know why I didn't think it was going to be.
I think because it's Sacramento and it's hot.
Well, hot's good. I don't really have any preconceived notions of Sacramento. This is really the first signing I've ever done in this neck of the woods. I did a Fangoria show in San Jose, I think, and I was supposed to do the famous Monsters show that got cancelled because of the wildfires. I don't know. You sometimes approach a show thinking this isn't going to be very good, for no apparent reason. And when we arrived yesterday morning, there were only like 10 people in black cotton outside the building, and I just thought this is going to blow. And when I was busy in the first hour, I thought, well, I'm going to be busy for the first hour and a half, and then Kane and I will be reminiscing for the rest of the day. I never got a chance to speak to him. I absolutely slammed all day yesterday, and so far today. I mean, I always say this on behalf of you. Kind of represent all of horror fandom for me. I've been doing conventions now for 30 years. 30 years in April was the anniversary of my first ever convention, my first ever trip to the United States, which I'm now proud to call my home, for Fangoria's Weekend of Horrors in Los Angeles in 1989. And since then I have been on the receiving end of the most devoted and loyal and knowledgeable fan base that anybody could hope to have. So, and it's kind of been a rolling embodiment of the creature called horror fandom over 30 years. Some of you probably weren't born when I was doing that first convention. But I love you all, and thank you. Except for the annoying... Oh, never mind.
You and Clive, you guys were friends before this thing even really took off.
Before Hellraiser took off?
Yeah.
Just a bit, yeah. In about 1969, where I was a pupil at Quarrybank High School in Liverpool, in England. My mate Jimmy Hughes said to me, I'm going to be in the school play. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, fuck you, if you're going to be in the school play, so am I. And so I went to my form teacher, master, Bruce Prince, who also directed the school plays. And I said, I've never been this pushy as an actor since. I basically said to him, hey sir, Jimmy Hughes says he's going to be in the school play. I want to be in the school play. And he looked at me and he said, all right, come with me. And he'd never get away with this now. It was 1969, as I say. He took me into the cloakroom, and he put a copy of the play in my hands, which was The Government Inspector by a Russian playwright, Nikolai Gogol. And he said, read that. Two kind of twinish, kind of like a Tweedledum and Tweedledee sort of characters, called Dobchinski and Bobchinski. And I read for one or the other of them. And he said, okay, be in rehearsals tomorrow. So I played Dobchinski or Bobchinski, and Jimmy Hughes played the other one. So I arrived for rehearsals and met my fellow cast members, which included Clive Barker, who was also in the school play. I was kind of already aware of him.
Yeah.
Ironically, it turned out that his parents knew my father before either of us were born. They used to go to a community centre on a little street that some of you may have heard of in Liverpool called Penny Lane. So they already knew each other. And I was kind of aware of Clive. You couldn't not be. He was a sort of a flamboyant character around the school. And he was then writing, directing, starring in, and hand-drawing the posters for his own plays.
Wow.
Which had titles like Voodoo and Inferno, so he hasn't travelled too far down the road in the last 50 years. And I went to see one of them, which involved ballet dancing Nazis in tutus, as I remember. As every good play should. Shakespeare missed a trick, I think. So that was my introduction to Clive, and I kind of got pulled into his orbit, and I did one of his plays, which was a kind of King Arthur ripoff called The Holly and the Ivy, which was entirely improvised, and it was a pretty powerful set of people. There was a wonderful girl called Jude Kelly, who is now the director of the South Bank complex in London, a guy called Dave Fishel, who went on to be artistic director of the Liverpool Playhouse. So it was a pretty high-powered bunch of people, one way or another. And I was initially certainly drowning, not waving, but I was also having the time of my life. And Clive, they used to let Clive take over the school hall for a week to put these plays on.
Yeah.
And we used to perform in the auditorium, the whole of the hall, and put the audience on the stage.
Huh.
And it was quite wonderful. I think the head teacher, Mr. W.E. Pobjoy, I think he knew he had a talent with Clive, and I think he knew he had a talent that he couldn't contain, he couldn't predict, and he couldn't control. I think they were aware of him. We both had a wonderful, wonderful English teacher called Norman Russell, who had been taught English at Oxford by Tolkien. And he set homework for Clive's English class, which was a piece of original composition about something or other. And when Clive got it back, it had those dreadful words at the bottom of it, "See me." So quaking in his shoes, he went up to speak to Norman, who said, "Oh yes, you'll notice I didn't mark this. Do you know why?" And Clive said, "No, sir." And he said, "I didn't mark it because I don't feel I'm qualified to. I want you to come and see me after school." And he threw open the windows of literature basically to Clive, and was the first person to tell him, "You have an extraordinary facility as a writer."
Wow.
and you need to pursue that. And I think Mr. Pobjoy was aware of that and just kind of knew he had to give Clive his head, really. The same head teacher a decade earlier had also found himself in possession of a different kind of uncontrollable mercurial talent in his school, and I think also decided not to fight him but to give him his head, gave him permission to form a skiffle band in the school, which the pupil named in honor of Quarrybank. He called the skiffle band the Quarrymen. Some of you may be ahead of me. I believe that pupil went on to have a bit of a career in the music industry. Name of John Lennon, I think. So I always said that my old headmaster could rest his head easily on the pillow, knowing he'd help launch the careers of John and of Clive.
Yeah, that's, I would say, unquestionable.
I'd take it.
As fate would have it, you get led into becoming, his Pinhead. But I know you do.
Yeah, we started doing theatre work together in Liverpool after school and university. Experimental theatre, crazy. I could talk for hours about that. I better not. And then by degrees, we moved down to London. We formed our own theatre company called the Dog Company, late 70s, doing original plays by Clive, which are all published now and have been independently produced, I think, in the States. My personal favorite, The History of the Devil, in which I played the devil, Frankenstein in Love, in which I played various parts, including Dr. Frankenstein, and The Secret Life of Cartoons, in which I played a giant cartoon rabbit, loosely based on Bugs Bunny, and various other roles. That came to its natural conclusion around 1982.
Okay.
And towards the end of the Dog Company, Clive was saying to me, here, read this. And these were handwritten manuscripts. And he said, I'm trying to write a few short horror stories, see if I can make a bit of money out of them. And they were handwritten manuscripts for stories that would shortly become the Books of Blood. And also a little number called The Hellbound Heart.
Yeah.
So the Dog Company came to an end around 82, 83, and Clive got those published, and boom.
Yeah.
I got my union card, and I was working as an actor in provincial repertory theatre up and down the country. And then I was at a party in 1985. It was Jane Wildgoose's birthday party. I don't know whether that name means anything to anyone. She designed and made the Cenobites' costumes in Hellraiser. She had also worked in the theatre company. And Clive said to me at that party, I'm trying to put together a low-budget independent British horror movie.
Yeah.
And I think there's a part in there for you. And I said, oh, okay, great, sounds cool. And then we moved on and talked about something else. That was the first time that the idea of Hellraiser came into my life. A year on from there,
Yeah.
we were in Cricklewood filming Hellraiser.
I know you do have some experience with like special effects makeup and makeup design and stuff.
Me personally?
Yeah, don't you?
Well, let's not over-exaggerate.
I was just curious, when it came to the design of him, a Pinhead, or just in general, did you get to sit into the room when they're coming up with, I'm sure Clive, the way that he writes, he knows what he wants them to look like before going into production, but did you get to have any say-so in any of that?
No. That was entirely Clive, and I would say between Clive and Jeff Portas, who designed and made Pinhead's makeup. But no, I didn't get any input in that. There was no need to, really. I mean, Clive already knew this guy. He had literally dreamt him up.
Yeah.
He'd already drawn him. He knew what he was looking at. The only variation I know was when I went to have my life cast done. Jeff showed me sketches of the makeup. The one we're all familiar with from the movie I had already seen, but there was another variation on a theme which was more tribal. So it was looser, and there were I always forget the name, you know, those things in the ears, those, and there was scarring, and it was a less ordered, less controlled image. Because that kind of tribal body modification was something that Clive was always fascinated with.
Yeah.
I mean, body modification was just not as common. We weren't as familiar with it as you know. What do you call those?
Oh, these, they're plugs.
Right, that's the word. Thank you. Just not as familiar as it is now.
Yeah.
But Clive always, I think, wanted to come back to that calm, ordered, geometric, rational piece of self-mutilation.
Yeah.
As the way that Pinhead would look. But no, I had no input in that.
When we see you guys in full blown, you know, for lack of a better term, formation, when the four of you make your presence known for the first time, it's pretty jaw-dropping, to say the least. The whole time in episode one, Hellraiser 1,
The pilot.
Hellraiser 1, I mean, we're dealing with Frank, and Frank's reanimating. It takes us a while to get us to that confirmation, to the big time scene of you. Were you guys, you know, chomping at the bit? How did they even film it, actually? Like, did they do your guys' stuff first or Frank first? Because I would be pumped if I was in that costume. So we were never there when Frank was doing his thing. No.
When I did We Want the Man Who Did This,
Yeah.
there was nothing there
Okay.
except the camera and the crew
Uh-huh.
there. That was my first scene. We Want the Man Who Did This. That was my first contribution. My first contribution to cinema, because Hellraiser was my first
Debut.
my first movie. I'm not quite sure how to answer the question. I mean, the answer is you're an actor for hire. You do your job. You turn up when you're told to turn up, and you should turn up prepared and knowing your lines, and try not to bump into the furniture and trip over things, which was actually a challenge for me, because I was coming to terms with wearing a skirt. Something I stress I was not used to. And also, I am very short-sighted, and the contact lenses they had given me were not made to my prescription and were black. So it was like, I took my contact lenses out and put a pair of very cheap sunglasses on, and then tried to find my way around. So not tripping over my skirt and not bumping into things was my first priority. And in fact, when I did that first scene, I did trip over my skirt. And they got clothes pegs and turned the hem of Pinhead's skirt up and clipped them. So you're saying in that costume you would be stoked? Absolutely. But by the time they've done that to you, your sense of dignity has been modified considerably. I learned, I mean, it's part of, I say this a lot of the physicality that you associate with Pinhead was forced on me, was me learning to make friends with the costume and not fight it. So to counter the tripping over thing, I learned to walk very slowly and to kick my feet out in front of me as I went, which helped to keep me very upright, which was how I felt in Pinhead. You can't walk like that.
Yeah.
I tried to do that to the skirt. So that physicality was me trying not to make a fool of myself. In the same way, the collar meant that my head movements were restricted.
Yeah.
And the costume, which was Jane made so brilliantly, that was the costume we used in the first 2 films. They were never as well made after that. Were quite restricting in the arms. So if I'm going to point at anything, I have to do it very straight-armed and deliberately. And also, I can't. Ask me a question, and I'll answer it. Any question, doesn't matter.
What did you have for lunch?
I had some very nice. You're scaring me. Last time I had a lovely girl sat on my lap, she was called Linda Blair. Grilled chicken. Barbecue chicken for the food truck outside. Who was it? Who said that? Oh, you. Well, you're like, you are invited. Now ask me a question, and I'll demonstrate what I mean about how Pinhead would turn out.
What's my favorite color?
My favorite color is red. What concern if it is yours? Take 2. What concern is it of yours? But that's me making a strength of a weakness. Because initially I'm trying to do that. I can't. So, okay, well, if you can't, don't try. So, take your time. Turn all of you. And now, maybe I can be bothered to answer them. It's all a bit tiring. Spencer Tracy had a wonderful trip. Marks in movies are very important. Because if you're on your mark, you're in focus, and you're lit. If you're beyond your mark, you're slightly out of focus, and you're slightly overlit. Up here, you're out of focus, and you're overlit. And of course, it's always a problem for actors, because I need to be able to look at you and maybe talk to you, know and be aware of my peripheral vision to know that I've got people on my part. Spencer Tracy decided, fuck that. If you watch Spencer Tracy, he does this when he has to walk to someone and speak. What he's saying is, well, I don't know about you, but I'm on my path. And now I'm prepared to deliver my life. Anyway, you were saying.
You're in a list, a very small list of people who have played the same horror character so many times. Was there an immediate connection to him after one? Did it grow? Obviously, as a fan, you'd almost think, I think we all think that it does for you as you played him so many times. What was it? Was it your relationship with Clive that got you started, or the franchise in general that kept you coming back to play Pinhead?
Sorry, but you know. Well, I don't really know how to answer that. While we were approaching making Hellraiser, nobody had a clue there was going to be a second one.
Yeah.
It was never in my thought. I had no idea I was doing anything other than playing a character with no name, buried in latex, who's going to be on screen for 8 minutes. What did I have to get excited about?
Yeah.
And Clive's intention with Hellraiser was not that the Cenobites should be the stars of the show. His focus was on Julia. He felt that he was creating the first great female monster in horror films.
Yeah.
I got lucky because I believe Clive wanted Julia and skinned Frank on the poster first, and he was told that he couldn't have a skinned man on the poster on bus stops, you know, upsetting old ladies doing their shopping on a Tuesday. So by default, I think, I got on the poster. So Pinhead literally became the poster boy.
Yeah.
For the movies, but I had no clue of anything. I mean, we knew while we were filming Hellraiser that the New World wanted to commit to a sequel.
Yeah.
But that was as much as I knew. But so the movie came out in 87, 88. We were back now at Pinewood Studios doing Hellbound. Clive was still involved. He was executive producer. I mean, all I could say in answer to your question at that point was I was thrilled and delighted to have a chance to do it again.
Yeah.
I had done absolutely no publicity in relation to the first film, and I was not in any way exposed to what was growing in fandom in relation to the Cenobites. But what had happened to Clive was that the Cenobites had snuck past Frank and Julia. I mean, it seems ridiculous to me that he ever thought differently, that if you create characters like Pinhead and Chatterer and then put them on a giant screen, that horror fans aren't going to say, them we like, and and them we could stand to see more of, thank you. And then by Hellraiser 3, Clive no longer being involved because of New Line going under and all of that legal shenanigans that went on. Peter Atkins still involved, having written the screenplay for Hellbound, also wrote the screenplay for Hell on Earth. But it had become a whole new deal by Hell on Earth. I mean, again, I was thrilled and excited to still be a part of it, to get another go round, and to get to come and work in the States for the first time.
With you guys going full-blown franchise, I think too is Pinhead arrived to that consumer, and he was so different than anything else that we'd ever seen. Like Freddy is pretty iconic when you first get a look at the full-blown Freddy, which you don't really do in the first one, hardly ever. But when you see him, but you guys, that film, right from the get-go, I mean, Skinned Frank, I mean, it doesn't pull any punches whatsoever. And when you go back and you were talking about Books of Blood, he doesn't pull any punches as an author either.
Not at all. The genius of what Clive did with Skinned Frank in Hellraiser is keep him on the screen. Most directors in horror films, if they're going to use a skinned man, it'll be a blood.
Yeah.
And that'll be it. Clive put Skinned Frank on screen, and sorry, I have my back turned to Batman the whole of this time. Extremely rude of me. He puts him on screen, he leaves him on screen, and Frank talks, and he smokes cigarettes, and he drinks red wine, and he falls in love and waxes eloquent. And that's I mean, clearly people are as familiar with Clive's work in general as you obviously are. The elegant monster, the elegant articulate monster is one of Clive's obsessions. Pinhead is one of them.
Yeah.
I've always said that, Pinhead is a horror monster who wouldn't be at a loss if he found himself at a garden party with Noel Coward and Oscar Wilde. He'd be happy to stand and trade aphorisms with them, and that's where Clive's imagination is always working. I mean, I've said that also that I think part of the genius of what Clive did with Hellraiser, and I don't like to throw the word around loosely, but I'll use it unashamedly, is that you can take the Cenobites out of that story, and you have a fairly serviceable but a bit dull, but entirely workable 1980s slasher movie. Because you have the relationship between Julia and Larry, and Julia and Frank, and their affair, and Frank being dead. You bring Frank back to life. You bring Kirsty into the equation with her questionable relationship with her father. All of that is intact. You have Julia going out and finding victims and bringing them home and beating their brains out with hammers and feeding them to Frank, and Frank killing Larry and adopting Larry's skin, and Kirsty saving the day. All of that storyline is intact and untroubled without even referencing the Cenobites, and it is, as I say, I think a fairly serviceable, perhaps a bit memorable slasher movie. Into the midst of that, Clive then drops full-blooded gothic horror in the form of the Cenobites. There are no misty castles and bats flying around, but the Cenobites are unashamedly out of the gothic tradition. And he just kind of drops that pebble in the middle of this pond, and wow, the ripples go, and the Cenobite, whereas so much of the rest of the movie is very identifiable as the 1980s. The Cenobites are out of time. I've said you could show images of the Cenobites to a 14th century monk, and he'd know exactly what he was looking at. And if we're all still here to discuss it in 300-400 years' time, the images of the Cenobites will still resonate.
And with that, my last question before we open it up to you guys is, what was it like playing both sides of the coin when you were delivering, Elliot Spencer and Pinhead as well? You getting to play, Elliot as just kind of this misfortunate guy who, his curiosity leads to open the puzzle, which then in turn starts the process in his transformation into Pinhead. I mean, that scene where you kind of morph each other when you morph into one, or even the scene that I thought was even cooler is Pinhead doesn't show up until the end, but the dream sequence with Christy too, when she thinks it's her dad, but then realizes that something's off, and
with Joey, in Hellraiser 3, right?
Joey,
yes. Well, it was a backstory that we kind of teased a bit at the beginning of Hellbound, and again at the end of Hellbound, which led then into Hellraiser 3 with the idea that Pinhead was now freed of the box, because he's always been a very rule-bound guy. He can only operate within the confines of the box. It's another thing that sets him aside from a lot of the other 70s and 80s horror characters in the main franchises, because he's not a boogeyman. He's not hiding behind in dark corners, waiting to slip the stiletto blade between your third and fourth ribs. That's not how he works. There's a whole series of steps. You have to become aware of the existence of the lament configuration. You have to be motivated enough to want to track one down, go through the bartering process to obtain one, work out how to physically open the puzzle, and then in Hellbound, when Tiffany opens the box, Pinhead stops anyone doing anything to Tiffany and says, it is not hands that call us, it is desire. It's not just the fact that you've solved the puzzle and opened the box, it's your motivation that is what ultimately is really interesting, Pinhead. And even then, he's going to want to stop and engage you in conversation. We'll get to the hooks and chains eventually, but you know, first of all, he wants to hear about those things that are lurking in the murky cobweb corners of your heads that you don't like to admit to. That's the stuff that you know that gives Pinhead a boner. That's what he is feeding on. I had a point to all of that when I started. Where was I going? What was the question?
It was the scene where Elliot kind of faces him down.
Yeah. So so all of that has changed. Was what I was was saying for Hellraiser 3. In fact, Pete Atkins said to me, his screenplay was a very intelligent response to a very stupid observation by one of the suits. Perish the thought that movie executives would make stupid observations. Whoever heard of this? What they said was, we need to make Pinhead more like Freddy. We need to get him out on the streets of New York, slicing and dicing. To which I would have said, had I been in the room, you know, expletives deleted. I'm a huge fan of Freddy Krueger. He does what he does.
Yeah.
Pinhead does what he does. Don't mix the two up.
Right.
Why? But so I think you can see, if you look at Hellraiser 3 in that light, that Pete's screenplay for Hellraiser 3 is a very, very intelligent response to a very dumb observation. Playing the two roles in Hellraiser 3, I mean, it's a gift that doesn't come along often, if at all, in an actor's career. So it was exciting to have that to do. And come the night when we were playing, where I was playing both characters, I started as Elliot. So I had 10 minutes in the makeup chair. 10 minutes. You're free to go. What? You're done already? No. I should have another 4 hours of this, surely. And I walked onto the soundstage. There had been a very long line of people, 7 feet tall, 5 feet tall, this wide, trying to persuade the director that they should be the person to stand in as Pinhead while I was playing Elliot. Not surprisingly, it was my stand-in who got the job. So I walk on set and I see Pinhead. And it was very strange. It's because I've never had that experience.
Right.
Everybody else had seen Pinhead.
Yeah.
I hadn't. It was the first time I'd stood outside the character and looked at him. And I remember feeling very angry. I had a kind of flush of, what the fuck are you doing in that? That's mine. I own that. Get the fuck out of it now. And then halfway through the night, I became Pinhead, and I think the second AD, Ty, played Elliot. There was one point where I was asked, when I was playing Elliot, I was asked to step onto Pinhead's marks and play something as Pinhead for a reference. I did that and then came back onto my marks to do Elliot's next line, which I did in Pinhead's voice, because I was getting terribly confused about who I was at that point. But it's a fun challenge. The tangled makeup stuff, that was physical. As we were morphing was the buzzword. Terminator had just kind of put morphing on the map, and it was just becoming available to us. But we had physical latex makeup,
Yeah.
so that had these curly pieces that Bob Keane would physically intertwined, and then we had to do kind of struggling fighting, but we couldn't do much of it.
Yeah.
And we couldn't pull because we'd come apart, but also if you got too violent with it, you would actually rip the latex, so you had to be very, very careful about how you were doing it. So that was all cool. I mean, it leads me to another afterthought, which is that I'm delighted that we got to do those movies prior to CGI.
Yeah.
I just love that you would look at the sequence of the birth of Frank in Hellraiser. I mean, that was literally put together, improvised on the day by Clive and Bob Keane. Bob running back into his temporary workshop at Cricklewood and grabbing bits of this and bits of that and a bit of a limb and putting them together and, you know, dribbling wallpaper paste and blood on them and little bits of puppet animation going on where he lifts up off the floor.
Yeah.
But if you'd gone back and filmed that the following week, it would have looked completely differently. And in every film, then all the special effects looked different because they were all handmade. They looked like Bob Keane's special effects or Tom Savini's special effects, and they didn't look like anybody else's.
Yeah.
CGI is a wonderfully liberating beast, obviously, because you can do all kinds of shit now that you could never have even contemplated doing then without a cast of gazillions.
Yeah.
But everything looks the same, and I always feel a bit disappointed
Yeah.
with CGI,
Yeah.
and it breaks the fourth wall. I see CGI and I'm immediately reminded that I'm watching a film,
Yeah.
and the aim is that you forget you're watching a film and believe in the reality of what you're watching. And it seems to me to be an ironic thing that CGI actually doesn't create the sense of reality in the same way, that a bit of latex and fake blood did.
Yeah. We do have time for a couple questions right here in the orange shirt.
What was your most favorite Hellraiser to film, and what was your least favorite to film?
Oh, Tales Out of School. I never had a bad experience on any of them. I'll say that up front. I mean, my favorite Hellraiser movie remains the first one. It went by in a little bit of a blur for me, I'll be honest. It was my first movie, so I had a lot to get used to in terms of what working on a film set was, quite apart from coming to terms with that while wearing latex and annoying contact lenses and a skirt and a constricting leather jacket. I go quite often to Hellraiser 3. I've made a lot of friends on Hellraiser 3, and Pete met his wife on Hellraiser 3, and it was just that kind of movie, very close. It was a strange setup because we shot it in High Point, North Carolina. We were billeted in the Howard Johnsons in High Point, and they'd built a studio in the grounds of the hotel. So you literally got up in the morning and went down to the hotel restaurant and had breakfast and walked across the parking lot and you were at work.
Mm.
And at the end of the day, you walked back across the parking lot and you were in the bar. And it worked pretty well. But I didn't really have a least favorite would probably be Inferno. It's my least favorite of the series, I think. And I don't think I'm egotistical, but when they sent me the script for Inferno. I started reading, and my first response was, this is very clever, because there's nothing here to tell you you're in a Hellraiser movie until you come to that, and it's the same watching the film, actually, until you come to that first murder scene. If you've never seen a Hellraiser film, at that point, you're still none the wiser. If you're a Hellraiser fan, you look at that murder scene and you know everything. You know exactly what went down here. You know the backstory. You know what's your pleasure, sir, and you know who's been here and what he's been doing. You know all that, and I thought that was quite clever. But I must admit, I was kind of page 30, page 40. Am I going to be in this? Page 50. Oh, look, here I am. Oh, there I go. Okay. Page 70, 80, 90, 105. Oh, there I am again. And gone again, and roll credits. 2 scenes. I could almost work out what I was being paid by the take on on Inferno, which was very nice, and I'd like to have carried that with me for the rest of my career. So, it was just a bit of an unsatisfactory thing because of that for me. Then, of course, the only image they used to sell the movie is Pinhead. And I think that's a bit wrong. I understand you hold your monster back, but then don't sell the movie on your monster, the movie on the back of your monster if you're not going to use him in the film. Of course, I had by now lost Pete and lost Clive, so the people who had put all those fantastic lines in my mouth had gone. A lot of the writing remained strong, but there were phrases, turns of phrase that to me didn't belong. They had Pinhead telling someone that he'd reached the end of the line, and I thought, no, that's not quite your suffering will be legendary even in hell, is it? And I went to Scott Derrickson, who wrote and directed the movie, and I kind of sheepishly raised this, and he said, oh God, if you feel you can put this in Pinhead's mouth, please, because writing for Pinhead was the hardest thing that we had to do on this film. So I did rewrite some of my dialogue on subsequent films, but I had an issue with the content right at the end when I'm confronting Craig Sheffer, the detective. Basically, Pinhead is saying, this is a bad thing and this is a good thing, and the good thing is killing, the bad thing is killing the good thing, and that, children, is a bad thing, and, honor your father and mother and look both ways before you cross the street. This is Uncle Pinhead saying, until next time. It just didn't feel right to me. It's a fine line, I think, if I can get a bit highfalutin and literary with this. French writer and director called Jean Cocteau, when the French novelist Jean Genet, whom you may know better as Jean Genie, was received into the French Academy of Literature, Cocteau gave his induction speech, and Cocteau said, the Genet is a moralist, which is not to be confused with one who moralizes. And I always held that in my head with Pinhead. He's a moralist in terms of what I said before, that he wants to know the dirty secrets that you hide and try to pretend that you don't have. But he's not a moralizer. He's not preaching good behavior at you. And I put this to Scott, but he wouldn't let me change the content of what Pinhead was saying. He was happy to let me change the way in which I said it, but not the what I was saying, which kind of rankled with me a bit.
We are running along, so we have time for one more. The Hood right here, standing up.
Right.
And, I just, as an artist and filmmaker, just big inspiration to me. I mean, it was like a true work of art because there's no budget behind it, it seemed like. So
Nothing.
maybe you can just
Well,
talk about that.
Salome, we had done. This is based on Oscar Wilde's play of Salome, and we had done a production of that, which actually involves my first brush with prosthetic makeup, because I was playing Yochanan in Wilde's play as John the Baptist, and he's blind. So Clive paper mache'd over my forehead and face. I mean, with toilet paper and wallpaper paste, and then kind of let it dry, and then painted blood and goop and bits of wall hanging out of the eye sockets soaked in blood as bits of tendril and crap. And then I'm blind. I mean, I'm completely blind. So I had a rope tied around my waist that was tied off at the back of the stage to stop me wandering off into the audience, having a vague idea of where I was on stage. Clive then decided he wanted to make it into a movie. We were teenagers. I mean, and Clive was filming on Super 8, and he couldn't master closing one eye, so he used to stuff a handkerchief under the one lens of his glasses so he could look down the lens. And we filmed it in Ann Taylor's auntie's florist's shop basement. We went in, we took all the vases of flowers out, and we filmed it down there. Some additional stuff on Formby Beach near Liverpool, and in a drama studio, with one handheld light stolen from Quarry Bank, and filmed on Super 8, which Phil Rimmer developed in his dad's bath at home. Out of all of that comes something pretty remarkable because of Clive and because of his extraordinary visual eye.
I think it still holds up. I mean, it's so creative. That was even before Racer thing.
Right. There's music that belongs to it too. When we used to screen it, we'd put LPs on. A bit of the score of King of Kings, a wonderful piece of music from, I think it's A Fistful of Dollars. It's either A Fistful of Dollars or A Few Dollars More, called The Watcher Watched. And Salome's Dance was performed to Pink Floyd's Sisyphus off the Ummagumma album, the very staccato piano section of that. So when we screened it, we'd put LPs on a record player and drop the needle on as the scene started, and then lift it off when the scene finished. Because we had no sound, so it's silent too. The Forbidden started life as an adaptation of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, with Peter Atkins playing Faustus. And it was a very going to be a very Jarman-esque kind of free adaptation. And I was working on the screenplay with Clive. It very quickly became something quite other that only Clive had in his head. Don't ask me to tell you what that is. Filming went on over a period of, I would say, close to 5 years. On 16mm now, but I would say certainly by the end of it, I didn't have a fucking clue what was going on. But Clive did, and it's pretty remarkable. I mean, you've seen more of Clive than you probably ever expected or needed to see. There's another thing in Forbidden, in the Forbidden, which will bring this all full circle, which is the nail board. Clive got a piece of wood and 6-inch nails, and he created a gridiron pattern on the board, and at each intersection he nailed in a 6-inch nail. Now, as you're aware, a lot of the forbidden, most of the forbidden, is done in negative and deliberately conceived back to front in Clive's head to film blacks white so that they register as false black in the film. So the black and white in the film is actually white and black in reality, filmed and then processed in negative to make false black and white. And what he did with the nail board, I have to stop and think about this, is he was rotating a light in front of the board so the shadows of the nails swung rhythmically like a sundial across the board. So he painted the, is this right? Yes, he painted the board white and the gridiron black, so the shadows are black against white, and then puts it in negative, so the nails are throwing white shadows onto a black background. 6 years later, he's turned that into a I was going to say a human being. I'm not sure that's quite appropriate. But that nail board is Pinhead, anthropomorphized. That's a genius.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are all out of time, but give it up.
Thank you.